Michael the Laine of the Copenhagen Voice, talking to James Stotts, Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, about life around the Arctic Circle or North Arctic Circle. James, you're mentioning about how climate change is affecting the permafrost and what that means.
Well, yes, should I repeat?
Yeah.
What I did? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the permafrost is melting in the Arctic, and the part of the Arctic that I'm from, the North Slope of Alaska, which is basically a wetland. As the permafrost melts, it affects our roads, it affects the foundations that our homes are on, so it has a dramatic impact on our daily living. One of the other concerns about the melting of the permafrost is that when the permafrost melts, it releases methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas much worse than CO2. And this will have an impact not only on us, but on the rest of the planet.
You said you had fairly good relations with the U.S. federal government. What about the Alaska government, state government?
Well, I would say that with the state of Alaska government, that we are in a somewhat adversarial position or situation with them. In some ways, we're actually in competition with the state. But with the federal government, we had a negotiation and a settlement with the federal government in the early 1970s, which settled the issue of land ownership and resources on our lands. There are continuing negotiations with the federal government on other issues, indigenous rights, that still need to be settled. I should tell you that for Inuit, we are in 4 countries, and so in Canada it's a similar story, although I would say that the Canadian Inuit have been able to negotiate a better settlement than we did, since we were the first one. Of course, here in Denmark, I know that people would know the story about what has happened in Greenland. It's recently going from home rule to self rule. And then in Russia, where we have some of our people, that's probably the place. Well, that is the place where settlement of indigenous rights is the most behind.
And what does the ICC want from COP15?
Well, we actually have a pretty simple wish list, I will call it. We have 6 points that we would hope would come out of the COP. We are leaving you some documents that you can review in some detail. But the first point is that we would like to see greenhouse gas concentrations stabilized at 350 parts per million by volume. Really what we're trying to affect is that the temperature does not rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. We would hope that the conference would recognize climate change impacts on Inuit by designating avoidance of climate change impacts in the Arctic as a key benchmark that can be measured for a post-2012 process. We would call upon the IPCC to develop a future assessment on climate change and indigenous peoples, fully utilizing indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge to make policy decisions. Finally, we would like to see the IPCC work with Inuit to create an international climate change adaptation fund financed by the G20 nations to help people adapt to climate change impact and to speed up technology transfer that's much needed. And we would suggest that the first investment should be at a level of $20 billion US, gradually growing to $100 billion US on an annual basis by the year 2020. We would hope that there would be a recognition of the vulnerability of Inuit and indigenous peoples by creating a way to provide adaptation assistance to vulnerable groups, those that are in the most vulnerable positions, and that assistance would provide financial support, technical assistance to communities such as Inuit, provide funding and decision-making to the lowest possible levels, down to the community level, rather than being funded or routed through the individual nation states. And that this must incorporate the right to free, prior, and informed consent as stated or understood under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And further, because of the unique status of Inuit are actually caught in the so-called developed world, we would like to see adaptation assistance to vulnerable groups such as ours, living within developed nations, but actually in subdeveloped situations and conditions. And then we would ask for support for Inuit to benefit and participate in appropriate technology so that our communities in the future can continue not relying on some of the old technologies which are either too expensive or antiquated. And so we have alternative energy sources and also better construction methods which make more efficient homes and the like.
Okay.
So those are really the 6 points that we're pushing at this call.
The Indigenous Environmental Network yesterday sent a message to President Barack Obama to make a deal here in Copenhagen that includes a moratorium on all new exploration of oil, gas, coal and uranium as a first step towards the full phase out of fossil fuels and a just solution to the climate crisis. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's imperative, actually. I don't see how the world can do that to call a moratorium on the development of these fuels without first having something to replace them. And I will also point out that for Inuit, we are actually owners of territory and land of our own, and including on some of these territories we actually have oil and gas, and we actually have mining, and we do not think it's right for us not to have the opportunity to develop those resources of our own. We're trying to move into the modern world ourselves. We would totally disagree with that viewpoint.
Okay. James Stotts, thank you much indeed.
Thank you.